I can still feel the weight of that evening pressing down on me. Even now. It was late spring in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of day that smells like rain-soaked earth and blooming magnolia trees. The storm had just passed, leaving behind puddles in the cracked pavement and a heavy, humid warmth that clung to the air. I remember walking up the front steps of my father's house, clutching a small black velvet box in my hand. I wasn't hiding it, but I wasn't exactly displaying it either. I was holding it close, as if it carried more than just what was inside. Inside that box was a diamond ring. Not just any ring, but one I had chosen myself, a brilliant cut stone that caught the light in a way that felt like magic. I had bought it as a personal reward, a small celebration of something I'd worked for and earned with my own 2 hands. It was a symbol, a private acknowledgement that I had made it farther than anyone, especially my father, ever believed I would. I thought that when I showed it to him, maybe he'd see me differently. Maybe he'd be proud. The front door creaked as I stepped inside. My shoes left faint, wet marks on the wooden floor. Dad was in the living room, the television on low, the faint glow of the screen lighting up his tired face. He looked up when he heard the door. For a second, there was just that blank moment where neither of us spoke. Then his eyes dropped to my hand. I didn't even realize the box was still open until I saw his gaze narrow, the lines in his forehead deepening. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp but not yet angry. "It's a ring," I said, my tone light, like I was easing into a conversation we hadn't had in years. I wanted to, but I never finished the sentence. His voice rose suddenly, harsh and full of accusation. "Where did you steal this?" I froze. The word steal hit me harder than I expected. "I didn't." "Shut up, you're a thief." His voice was louder now, booming through the quiet house. The anger in his tone made my heart pound, but I still tried to make my explanation. "Dad, and then it happened. The slap. It came so fast that my head turned with the force of it. The sting spread across my cheek, hot and immediate. My eyes watered, not from the pain alone, but from the shock of it. I hadn't been slapped by him since I was a child, back when arguments were over curfews or missing homework. This felt different. This was not discipline. This was rejection. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I looked back at him. His face was red, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes fixed on me like I was some stranger who had broken into his home. I wanted to scream at him, to shout that I had bought the ring with money I'd earned, that I had spent years building a life that no one had thought I was capable of. But my throat felt tight, and the words wouldn't come. He stepped forward, his voice low now, but sharper than ever. "Get out of my house. I don't want to see you again." For a moment, I thought he didn't mean it. Surely, this was just anger talking, the way people say things they regret when tempers run high. But then I saw it. The way his eyes refused to soften, the way he pointed at the door like it was the only place I belonged. Something inside me broke then, but I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't explain. I just slipped the ring back into its box and closed it with a soft click. I walked to the door, each step heavier than the last. The house felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closing in on me, pressing me toward the outside. The night air hit me as soon as I stepped out, cool against my burning cheek. I stood on the porch for a moment, the sound of the crickets filling the silence my father had left behind. My hands trembled, but I gripped the velvet box tighter, feeling the hard edges dig into my palm. That little box was the only proof I had in that moment that my life was mine, that my success was real, even if he refused to see it. I walked down the steps and onto the street, my mind racing. The house behind me had been my home for most of my life, the place I'd taken my first steps, learned my first words, and dreamed my first dreams. But now it was just a building. My father had turned it into something I couldn't go back to, no matter how much I wished I could. As I made my way toward my car, parked a block away, I thought about the years that had led to this moment. He had never believed in me. Not when I left college to work in retail. Not when I spent long nights studying gemology courses online. Not when I scraped together every spare dollar to rent a tiny space for my first shop. In his eyes, I was still the reckless girl who didn't know what she was doing. And maybe that's why, when he saw the ring, his first thought wasn't pride, it was suspicion. When I reached my car, I slid into the driver's seat and just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The street lamp overhead flickered, casting a pale yellow light into the cabin. I opened the box again and looked at the ring. The diamond caught the light even in the dimness, sending little sparks of brilliance across the dashboard. It was beautiful. It was mine. I thought about turning back, walking in, and forcing him to hear me out. I imagined shoving the receipt into his hand, telling him every detail about how I had earned the money, describing the months of work, the clients, the late nights. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. His mind was made up before I ever walked through the door. So instead, I put the car in gear and drove away. The tires hissed on the wet road, the sound fading as the distance between me and the house grew. I didn't know exactly where I was going. Maybe back to my apartment. Maybe just somewhere I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning in someone else's judgment. All I knew was this. I wasn't going to let him take this from me. Not the ring. Not my work. Not my pride. The rain started again, soft at first, then heavier. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm, and with each pass, the house behind me became a smaller and smaller memory. I didn't cry until much later that night, when I was alone in my apartment, sitting on the floor with the velvet box open in front of me. The tears weren't for the slap. They weren't even for the words he had said. They were for the truth I finally understood, that some people will never see who you've become because they can't let go of who they think you are. And in that moment, I knew the next chapter of my life was going to start without him. By the time my father had thrown me out, my jewelry shop in Savannah had already been open for 2 years. It wasn't some side hobby or weekend market stall. It was my life's work. The store sat on the corner of a brick-lined street, just a few blocks from the riverfront. The sign above the door read Heart and Stone in elegant gold lettering, a name I had chosen to sound both timeless and strong. Every morning, I would arrive before the sun fully rose, unlock the heavy glass door, and step into the quiet hum of my little world. Inside, the air always carried a faint mix of lavender polish and fresh coffee. The display cases gleamed under warm spotlights, each piece arranged carefully on soft velvet stands. I designed most of them myself, from delicate silver bracelets to bold diamond necklaces. Some were commissioned by customers who knew exactly what they wanted. Others were born in the quiet hours after closing, when inspiration struck and I'd sketch by the light of my desk lamp. The diamond ring that had caused my father to lash out wasn't meant for anyone else. It wasn't an engagement ring or a gift. It was mine, a token of survival, a small luxury I allowed myself after closing my biggest sale yet. The sale had been to a client from New York City, a tall, sharp-dressed woman named Caroline Fletcher. She had commissioned a custom necklace with a sapphire centerpiece, surrounded by small diamonds I had sourced from a trusted supplier in Europe. Caroline had paid $12,000 for the piece without blinking, and when she left the store that day, I had felt a rush of pride I hadn't felt in years. That night, I went online, found the diamond ring I'd been eyeing for months, and bought it. Of course, my father knew none of this. In his mind, I was still the irresponsible girl who once overdrew her bank account buying a leather jacket she couldn't afford. He had never asked about my work, never visited my shop, never once shown interest in how I supported myself. I had stopped trying to explain years ago, when it became clear that the only stories he wanted to hear about me were the ones that fit his version of who I was. My apartment was nothing like the house I grew up in. It was a one-bedroom loft with high ceilings and exposed brick, the kind of place that felt both modern and warm. I had filled it with mismatched furniture I found at antique shops and weekend markets. There was a little balcony overlooking the street, where I liked to sit in the evenings with a cup of tea and watch the city lights flicker on one by one. It wasn't much compared to the big family home, but it was mine, and every piece of it had been paid for with my hard work. Running the shop wasn't easy. I wasn't just the owner. I was the buyer, the designer, the marketer, the cleaner, and sometimes even the repairwoman. There were days when my feet ached from standing for hours, and nights when I stayed up late resetting stones or restringing pearls. But there was something deeply satisfying about it, about opening the store in the morning, seeing a customer's eyes light up when they found the perfect piece, and knowing that I had made it possible. I remember one afternoon in particular, not long after my father had kicked me out. A young couple walked in, tourists from Chicago. The man had been saving up to buy his girlfriend a ring, and she had no idea why they were in the shop. While she wandered around looking at earrings, he leaned across the counter and whispered, "I want something that will make her jaw drop, but I've only got about $1,500 to spend." I showed him a simple, yet elegant white gold ring with a small but flawless diamond. It wasn't flashy, but it had a quiet beauty to it. He loved it immediately. When he proposed to her right there in my shop, she cried, and for a moment, I forgot all about my troubles. That was the kind of magic my work brought into people's lives, and no one could take that from me. Still, there were nights when the weight of my father's words crept back into my thoughts. I would sit at my workbench, turning the diamond ring over in my hand, wondering why his opinions still mattered to me. It wasn't as though I needed his approval to survive. I had proven I could do just fine without it. But there's something about a parent's voice. No matter how much you try to silence it, some part of you still listens. Savannah itself became my refuge. The cobblestone streets, the shade of the oak trees draped in Spanish moss, the rhythm of the waves against the shore, it all reminded me that life could be beautiful, even after it broke you. I made friends with other small business owners in the area. Greg, who ran the bakery across the street and always brought me a fresh croissant in the mornings. Linda, who owned the bookstore 2 doors down and insisted on lending me novels she thought I'd love. They became a kind of chosen family, the people who celebrated my wins and stood by me when sales were slow. I kept my success quiet. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't see the point in announcing it to people who didn't care. My father's side of the family rarely called, and when they did, it was usually to ask for something, not to ask how I was doing. So I built my life without them, piece by piece, like setting stones into a ring. There were moments, though, when I thought about what it would be like if he walked into my shop one day. Would he see the displays and the awards on the wall and finally believe I was more than the girl he had dismissed? Or would he still find a way to look past it, to convince himself it didn't matter? For now, those were questions I didn't need to answer. My focus was on my work, on the customers who trusted me to create something they would treasure, on the steady growth of my business, on the quiet satisfaction of seeing a dream become real. Every morning when I turned the key in the shop door, I felt the same thing, a small, defiant joy. I had been thrown out of my father's house with nothing but my car, a few bags, and a ring he thought I had stolen. But here I was, still standing, still creating, still owning something no one could take from me. And deep down, I knew, sooner or later, the world would notice. It was a warm morning in early June when everything shifted. The shop smelled faintly of fresh polish and coffee, and sunlight spilled through the front windows, landing in golden patches on the hardwood floor. I had just opened for the day, arranging a few new pieces in the display case, when the bell above the door chimed. In walked a couple from Boston, tourists by the look of them. The man in a neatly pressed polo shirt, the woman wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat. They had been recommended to me by someone at their hotel, and were looking for a special anniversary gift. I pulled out a tray of diamond bracelets, each one sparkling under the warm lights. We talked about designs, about the difference between white gold and platinum, about the way certain cuts catch the light differently. I love moments like that. Guiding someone to the perfect choice, seeing their eyes light up when they know they found it. While the couple debated over 2 options, my phone started buzzing in my pocket. Once, twice, then again. I ignored it. Customers always came first, and besides, whoever it was could wait. But then it kept going, a steady stream of vibrations that became impossible to ignore. I slipped my phone out just enough to glance at the screen. 10 missed calls. All from numbers I knew well. Dad, Mom, and my brother are in Chicago. I frowned. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the night I walked out of my father's house, and now they were all calling one after another? I tucked the phone away again. The couple finally chose a bracelet, a delicate piece with alternating diamonds and emeralds set in platinum. As I boxed it up for them, I caught sight of something on the counter. It was the morning newspaper, folded neatly. I hadn't touched it yet, but the front page caught my eye. There, above the fold, was a photograph of me, standing in front of my shop, smiling as I held a framed certificate. Savannah woman wins National Jewelry Award. The words felt unreal for a second. I reached out and pulled the paper closer. The article explained how I had won the Best Independent Jewelry Designer in America award, a national honor given only once a year. It mentioned my designs, my shop, and even quoted a few clients who had praised my work. Someone from the award committee must have sent the press release to the local papers, and they decided to make it a feature story. I could see why my family was calling. For years, I had been the black sheep, the one who never got her life together, and now there I was, in print, with a headline that made it impossible to ignore my success. By noon, my missed calls had climbed to 30. I also had texts. Saw the paper. Call me, from Mom. Wow, guess you've been busy, from my brother. And from Dad, just one line. We need to talk. I didn't reply to any of them. It wasn't anger that kept me from calling, not exactly. It was the fact that I knew what would happen if I picked up. There would be no real apology, no acknowledgement of the slap, no recognition of how wrong they'd been to assume the worst about me. Instead, there would be small talk, maybe even praise, but all wrapped in the unspoken assumption that now I had proven myself worthy of their attention. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I focused on the customers who walked through my door that day. Some were regulars who congratulated me after seeing the article. Others were new faces drawn in by the headline. Business was good, maybe the best it had been since opening, but I felt a strange heaviness under the excitement, like a shadow hanging just out of sight. That night, after closing, I sat in the back room of the shop with the newspaper spread out on the workbench. I traced the printed photo with my fingertip, studying the smile on my face. It was genuine, I realized. That moment, receiving the award, standing in front of my store, had been one of the proudest of my life. But now, with my phone buzzing again in my bag, it felt complicated. This was supposed to be a moment I shared with the people who mattered most to me. Yet the people who were calling hadn't been there when I was struggling to make rent, when I stayed up until 2 a.m. soldering chains or setting stones, when I worked weekends just to keep the doors open. They hadn't asked. They hadn't cared. Not until now. I closed the paper and leaned back in my chair. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. My phone buzzed again, Dad's number flashing across the screen. I let it ring. When it stopped, it buzzed almost immediately with a text. I'm proud of you. Can we meet? The words landed like a pebble in deep water, rippling through me in ways I didn't want to admit. Part of me wanted to believe he meant it. But another part, the part still remembering the sting of his hand across my face, didn't trust it. The truth was, I didn't know if I wanted a meeting. I didn't know if I wanted to give him the chance to turn this into something that made him feel better instead of something that made me feel whole. So I slipped the phone into my bag, locked up the shop, and walked out into the warm summer night. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the scent of jasmine from the planters outside the windows. I passed people laughing on the sidewalk, couples holding hands, families taking evening strolls. Life went on as it always did, no matter what headlines said. When I reached my apartment, I set the newspaper on the kitchen counter. I didn't hide it, but I didn't frame it or pin it to the wall either. It was an achievement. Yes, one I had earned entirely on my own, but it wasn't the end of the story. Before bed, I stepped out onto the balcony and looked down at the street. The lights from the shops and bars cast a warm glow, and somewhere in the distance, music drifted through the air. I thought about my father's text again. Can we meet? Maybe one day. But not tonight. Tonight, the award, the store, the life I had built, they were mine. And I wasn't ready to share them with anyone who had only started caring when they saw my picture in the paper. I slipped the diamond ring onto my finger before turning in for the night. It caught the light from the bedside lamp, throwing small sparks onto the wall. It was the same ring my father had accused me of stealing, the same ring that had started all of this. And now, it was the quiet reminder that I didn't need anyone's permission to shine. That night, Savannah seemed quieter than usual. The streets outside my apartment were mostly empty, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. I sat on my balcony, my legs tucked beneath me, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside me. The city lights shimmered like scattered gems, and for a moment, I let myself simply breathe. Then my phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with his name, Dad. The same name I had seen over and over for the past 2 days. The same name I had ignored each time. I didn't pick up. It wasn't hatred that kept my finger from swiping to answer. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was something deeper, a kind of clarity I hadn't had before. I had finally learned that not everyone who raises you believes in you, and that no amount of success or recognition can force them to see you differently. Sometimes, the only way to protect yourself is to walk away. I leaned back in my chair and looked up at the stars. Somewhere down the block, I could hear faint music drifting from a bar, the rhythm carrying through the warm night air. My mind wandered back to the night he had slapped me. The shock, the sting, the way he had looked at me like I was a stranger. That moment had split something in me. Not just the bond between us, but the last thread of hope I'd held onto that one day he would see me for who I really was. The truth was, I had built something without him. Without his approval, without his encouragement, without his help. Every sale in my shop, every glowing customer review, every late night spent working until my eyes ached, it was all mine. And no one, not even my father, could rewrite that history. Inside, the ring sat on the kitchen counter in its velvet box, just where I had left it after the newspaper article came out. I went inside and picked it up. The box clicked softly as I opened it. The diamond caught the light, throwing tiny sparks across the countertop. I slipped it onto my finger. It fit perfectly, just as it had the day I bought it. But now, it wasn't just a ring. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't stolen a single thing in my life. I had earned it all. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Mom. "Your father wants to talk. Please just hear him out." I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting it face down. I did not doubt that he wanted to talk now. The headline had done what years of hard work hadn't. It had made me visible to him. But I wasn't willing to become a trophy for someone who had once thrown me out without a second thought. The next morning, I opened the shop as usual. Greg from the bakery popped in with a paper bag and a smile. "Brought you the almond croissants you like." "Oh, and congratulations, saw the article." I thanked him, and as I bit into the warm, flaky pastry, I realized that these were the people who had been there for me. Not because of an award, not because my name was in print, but because they saw me, even before the rest of the world did. That day, I sold a pair of diamond earrings to a woman celebrating her daughter's graduation, restrung an old family heirloom for a man who had inherited it from his grandmother, and sketched a custom design for a young artist who had saved for months to buy something unique. These moments mattered more than any phone call I might have answered. They were real. When I closed the shop that evening, the sky was streaked with gold and lavender. I walked the long way home, past the park where the oak trees cast deep shadows over the cobblestones. A breeze carried the scent of the river, and I thought about how far I'd come since the night I'd left my father's house with only a few bags and that diamond ring. Back on the balcony, I watched the city lights flicker to life one by one. My phone sat on the table, silent for the first time in days. I knew the calls would probably start again tomorrow, but I also knew I didn't have to answer them. My life wasn't waiting for anyone's permission anymore. I thought about what forgiveness might look like, not for him, but for me. Maybe one day I would sit across from my father and listen to what he had to say. Maybe I would tell him about the store, about the long nights, about the customers who had become family. But if that day ever came, it would be on my terms. For now, I was content to let the distance remain. I took a sip of tea, now freshly made, and traced the smooth metal of the ring on my finger. It was warm from my skin, solid and certain. It was everything I had fought for. The night deepened, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. I thought about all the times I had doubted myself, all the moments when I had been tempted to believe the worst about who I was because someone else had told me so. Those voices were quieter now, almost like echoes. I wasn't the same woman who had walked up the steps of that house holding the velvet box. I wasn't the same woman who had stood there, stunned and silent after being slapped. That woman had been searching for approval. This woman, the one sitting here tonight, didn't need it anymore. I finished my tea, leaned back in my chair, and smiled at the quiet. The city kept moving beyond the balcony, life going on in 1,000 different ways. And I knew I would keep moving too, forward, always forward. I never looked back.